The snow had come softly that morning, falling like whispered secrets across the frozen frontier. Each flake settled on the roof of James Callahan's cabin, on the limbs of pine trees, and on the silent tracks of a horse long gone. James himself stood at the edge of the porch, hands tucked deep into the pockets of his dark brown shirt, eyes tracing the distant ridges of mountains that wore a cloak of white. The world felt hushed, as if the snow had muted the town below, and with it, the chatter and judgment he had carried for years. He had been called many things, lonely, stubborn, untouchable, but here, among the frost and pine, there was only the echo of his own heartbeat and the slow, steady rhythm of survival. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and burning wood. A kettle simmered on the hearth, sending curls of steam that mingled with the faint scent of horse leather and cold wool. James moved with careful, deliberate motions, stacking logs, checking the latch on the door, polishing the worn edge of his holstered pistol. His life had become a series of small, predictable routines. The predictability was comforting, and yet, in the quiet of the morning, a hollow ache lingered beneath his ribs. He had lost more than he had ever dared to hold close. Love had slipped through his fingers once, and the memory of it was a frost that refused to melt. The sudden crunch of footsteps on freshly fallen snow startled him. He turned, expecting perhaps a stray traveler or some wandering townsfolk, but instead, there she stood, Eloan Greyhawk, young, poised, her dark green dress brushing the snow-covered ground, her long hair flecked with ice. She looked at him not with hesitation, but with a quiet certainty that made the air seem heavier with expectation. "I heard you need a wife," she said, her voice low, unassuming, carrying across the distance between them like a soft bell toll. James blinked, caught off guard. The words were simple, yet they struck a chord in the deep recesses of his solitude. He wanted to respond, to ask who had sent her, what town rumor had reached her ears, but the snow and the silence held him frozen. Instead, he simply stood, his gaze measuring her presence, the way she braved the cold without complaint, and the faint trace of determination in her eyes. Eloan did not move forward immediately. She merely waited, her boots leaving shallow impressions in the snow. She seemed unbothered by the distance, confident in the unspoken understanding that they were both travelers in lives that had known isolation. James felt a pang of unease. He was not accustomed to visitors, let alone ones who spoke so openly of joining his life, however delicately. Yet something in the way she carried herself, the quiet steadiness that matched the rhythm of falling snow, stirred a curious tenderness he had long believed dormant. It was days before they spoke again. Each encounter was punctuated by small gestures that built a fragile bridge of understanding. Eloan would help with the firewood, stacking logs with careful hands, her breath misting in the cold air. James observed her, learning the subtle language of kindness. The way she adjusted a frozen latch on the cabin door, how she carried water without complaint, the almost imperceptible smile when she noticed the smallest comforts he afforded himself. Words were sparse between them, but the silence spoke volumes. In it, James felt the slow thawing of old fears and the stirrings of a hope he had nearly forgotten. The town beyond the mountains was a place of judgment. Rumors traveled faster than the wind over snowdrift. "The lonely cowboy," they whispered. Why would a young woman go to him? James was aware of the scrutiny, of the eyes that weighed each action and measured character in half-truths. Yet Eloan faced it with an unflinching grace, unafraid to meet the glances of strangers or endure the gossip that drifted through the cabins and saloons. Her resilience impressed him more than he cared to admit. It challenged the stoicism he had cultivated as armor, reminding him that courage could take the form of quiet dignity as much as bold defiance. One evening, as the snow fell heavier than usual, James found her sitting at the cabin's edge, her knees drawn beneath her dress, hands clasped over them. The wind tugged at her hair, and the pale light of dusk shimmered through the frosted trees, casting her in a delicate halo. He approached silently, the crunch of his boots on snow announcing his presence in the way only a careful observer could notice. "It's cold," he said simply, gesturing toward the cabin door. Eloan shook her head, not as refusal but as a statement of patience. She had no fear of discomfort, only an understanding that the world often moved slower than hearts desired. "I don't mind," she murmured. Her words, soft and unassuming, carried with them an unexpected warmth. James felt an unfamiliar tug, a shift in the way he regarded the world, a subtle recognition that perhaps he was not as alone as he had believed. Their days settled into a rhythm shaped by survival and shared quiet. Eloan learned the paths through the woods, the hidden tricks to ice and snow, while James discovered the gentle ways to offer protection without smothering, guidance without command. Each gesture was small, intimate. The way he handed her a mug of steaming tea without words, the way she brushed snow from his shoulders with a patience that acknowledged his silent burdens. Emotional barriers began to crumble, not with declarations, but with the steady accumulation of trust and shared understanding. The nights were the most revealing. They would sit before the hearth, the firelight dancing across their faces, illuminating the creases and shadows that spoke of experience and resilience. James occasionally allowed himself to share fragments of his past, losses he had endured, the loneliness that had carved hollows into his days. Eloan listened, never pressing, simply acknowledging, her presence a balm to wounds he had long ignored. In turn, she spoke of family, of a childhood threaded with both hardship and quiet wonder, of lessons learned in patience and courage. In the exchange, they discovered a rare intimacy, one born not from grand gestures but from the courage to bear vulnerability in a world that often demanded stoicism. It was during one particularly relentless snowfall that James began to recognize the depth of his change. He found himself noticing the small things, the way her eyes caught the flicker of firelight, the tilt of her head when she considered a question, the sound of her boots against packed snow. The world outside could rage, storms, gossip, cold, but within the cabin, there was a fragile sanctuary of understanding and emerging affection. For the first time in years, he felt a connection that did not demand anything but authenticity, a companionship built from the soil of shared survival and quiet respect. Even as the snow continued to blanket the world in white, life within the cabin hummed with understated vitality. Eloan's presence was a constant, unspoken reminder that life could be rebuilt, that hearts could endure and heal. James, who had once believed solitude to be the only sure companion, found himself anticipating her movements, cherishing the warmth of her proximity, and quietly protecting the rhythm they had created together. There was no rush, no urgency, only the slow, deliberate unfolding of two lives beginning to intertwine. On the eve of the first week of her arrival, they stood side by side on the porch, watching the snow settle into patterns over the horizon. James felt the weight of his past lift, ever so slightly, as if the snow itself had absorbed some of the bitterness he had carried. Eloan's hand brushed against his arm, fleeting yet deliberate, and he did not recoil. Instead, he allowed himself to acknowledge it, a subtle surrender to a feeling he had long avoided. They did not speak, there was no need. In the shared silence, a mutual understanding passed between them, delicate and profound, a promise not yet named, but already felt. As night fell, the cabin glowed warmly against the endless expanse of white. James lit another candle, casting shadows across the wooden walls, while Eloan tended the hearth. Outside, the snow continued its quiet descent, muffling the world beyond and wrapping the cabin in a protective shroud. For a man who had long considered himself beyond hope, and for a woman who had known the sting of isolation, this simple domesticity was transformative. They had built a fragile rhythm of life together, grounded not in words, but in trust, patience, and the quiet affirmation of presence. The section closes with them sitting together by the fire, the storm raging softly outside, and a sense of fragile anticipation in the air. James allows himself a tentative smile as he watches Eloan stir the coals, and she glances up, returning the smile with one of her own. Though the path ahead remains uncertain, and the town beyond the woods will continue to murmur, There is a budding understanding, a delicate promise forming in the quiet of winter. In the hush of falling snow, hearts have begun to speak, and the story, like the snow, continues its gentle descent, covering the past, shaping the present, and hinting at the warmth yet to come.